across every civilization, from Vikings to Mayans to Aztecs. Humanity keeps telling the same story over and over again. You see, a rose by any other name is still a rose, and Christ by any other name is still Christ. Before Jesus ever walked the earth, every culture was already dreaming of him. There's a spark inside the human soul, a secret fire, a whisper of the infinite trapped in mortal flesh. And every man feels it, even if he tries to deny it, even if the world tries to smother it out, even if the culture tells him he's nothing more than atoms. But you know better, because when you are alone with your own thoughts, when the noise dies, when the mask slips, you can feel something ancient glowing in your chest, a presence, guidance, a pressure pushing you towards who you were meant to become. And some people carry this spark very faintly, like embers buried under the ash. And others carry it fiercely, like a wildfire waiting for the wind. But every once in 1,000 generations, that spark does something impossible. It becomes a flame so pure, so unbearable, so intensely radiant, the entire world can't help but gather around it. And that flame has a name: Jesus of Nazareth. He wasn't simply a teacher, not merely a prophet. He was not just another myth in the endless catalog of human gods. He was the purest carrier of the divine spark that humans have ever witnessed, the clearest window into the mind of God, the exact point when heaven touches earth without distortion. And here is the mystery that nobody talks about. Christianity didn't spread because Rome forced it. It didn't dominate the world because of politics or armies or empires. It conquered the human heart long before it conquered geographically. Because every tribe on earth, from the Vikings of the north to the philosophers of Greece, to the shamans of the Siberian tundra, to the warriors of Mesoamerica, was already waiting for him. They had already heard the echo of his story in their own midst. They had already seen the patterns, the dying God, the returning of God, the God who bleeds to save the world. Every culture has the puzzle piece, but Jesus was the picture on the box. This is why Christianity has done what no religion in history has ever done. It has resonated with every people, every nation, every mythic imagination. It made sense to the Norse because Bard had already died and risen in their legends. It made sense to the Greeks because Dionysus had already walked the path of destruction and rebirth. And it made sense to the Aztecs, the Mayans, the Toltecs, because they had already prepared a throne for the one who would return from the east. Christianity didn't erase their stories, it completed them. Because Christ, the universal Christ, the divine spark, is the gravitational center of the human soul. We were all born orbiting him, whether we know him by name or not. And when he finally steps into history, the world recognizes its king. When Christianity enters a new culture, it doesn't conquer it by force. It conquers it with recognition. It doesn't erase the people's story. It completes it. It snaps into a place like a final puzzle piece that every civilization has been carving towards for thousands of years. Every great myth, every sacred hero, every god who dies and returns, they're all shadows cast by the same eternal light. And when that light finally appears in the world as Jesus of Nazareth, humanity encounters something it has been waiting for. So the Norse didn't meet Christ as a stranger. They heard the gospel and said, "We have seen this before." They saw Baldur, the innocent god, pierced by betrayal, descending into the underworld, promising to return at the end of the age to renew creation. They heard Christ, and felt the echo of a truth older than their sages, a flame they had been tending towards, knowing its name. The Greeks didn't resist the message either. They recognized Dionysus, the god torn apart, scattered, resurrected, returning with powers of judgment. They saw a pattern they had carved into marble for centuries. They realized the logos they had worshipped in fragments had finally taken on flesh and walked among them, and the Mesoamericans. They heard the story of Christ and whispered, "He has come back," because they had already known of a God who walked among them, a God who taught, a God who suffered, a God who promised to return in the year of prophecy. They recognized him not because they understood the Bible, but because they understood the sacred pattern. This is a secret most historians are afraid to say out loud. Christ feels familiar because the human soul already knows him. We know him instinctually, like a child recognizes the sound of its mother's heartbeat. We know him because his story is the structure of reality itself. We know him because every culture has been dreaming the same divine man, the innocent one who suffered, the king who died, and the God who returns. You see, civilizations separated by oceans, mountains, and millennium all carved the same shape into their mythic memory. They all left behind the same silhouette in their story, a silhouette that perfectly matches the figure of Christ. When Christianity enters a new world, the people don't say this is foreign. They say this is the story we were trying to tell, because the soul knows when it's hearing truth. Your soul knows when a myth becomes flesh. Your soul knows when a pattern becomes a person. Christ does not fit every culture by force. He fits every culture because he built them. He is the architect behind their myth. He is the mind behind their metaphysics. He is the divine spark that every civilization has been trying to articulate in its own language since the beginning of time. Christ, by any other name, is still Christ. Yes, the story changes, the symbols change, the languages change, but the pattern, the eternal sacred pattern, remains the same. This is why Christianity succeeds everywhere, not because it's imposing a foreign God, but because it has awakened the one the human heart already has known. Before a single European ship crossed the Atlantic, before the first cross was risen on this continent, there existed a world so sophisticated, so mathematically precise, so spiritually intense that even modern people with satellites and supercomputers still cannot grasp how they achieved what they did. Mesoamerica was not a primitive land. It was a cosmic civilization. This was a society where astronomy wasn't a hobby. It was a sacred language. They tracked Venus with the accuracy of NASA, only confirmed in the 20th century. And they measured time in cycles of such complexity that you could spend your entire life studying them and still only scratch the surface. Their stones weren't just stone monuments. They were instruments, aligned to the heavens, built to tone human life to the heartbeat of the universe. And their calendars weren't just dates. They were portals, revealing the rise and fall of ages, the destiny of nations, the very rhythm of creation itself. This was a world where mathematics, spirituality, and astronomy merged into a single truth, that the cosmos is alive and humans exist inside a living story. And here's what people today get wrong. The gods of Mesoamerica were not monsters. They were not bloodthirsty demons. They were not primitive superstition carved out of fear. Their gods were archetypes, cosmic metaphors for forces every culture has tried to understand. They were the faces of time, of fate, of life, death, duality, creation, destruction, renewal. The same forces the Greek named, the same forces the Norse sung about, the same forces Christianity speaks of when they talk about judgment, mercy, sacrifice, and resurrection. But the Mesoamericans encoded their truth in a way that shocks modern minds, because their spirituality was not symbolic only. It was embodied. It was enacted through ritual, through sacrifice, through the belief that human life and cosmic order were inseparable. To live was to participate in creation. To die was to feed the sun so it could rise again. And the Europeans had no idea, none, what kind of metaphysical intelligence they were about to encounter. And at the center of this world, standing like a bridge between heaven and earth, was one of the most mysterious beings in the history of myth. A god who was both man and divine, a teacher who brought wisdom, writing, and civilization, a king who descended to earth, suffered, was betrayed, and promised to return. A God whose story echoed so closely to the story of Christ that when the Spaniards finally arrived, the people of Mesoamerica did not see invaders. They saw prophecy. They saw the return of the one they had been waiting for, and his name was Quetzalcoatl. The Mayans called him Kukulkan. Aztecs called him Quetzalcoatl. But every culture who has ever uttered his name felt the same shiver in their bones, because they were just speaking about a deity. They were speaking about a memory, a cosmic intuition, the echo of a divine pattern that humanity somehow knows before it is taught. Quetzalcoatl was the impossible fusion, the serpent, the symbol of earth, matter, roots, and mortality, crowned with the radiant feathers of a quetzal bird, symbol of sky, breath, spirit, and divinity. He was the bridge between worlds. He was the ladder between dust and the stars. He was the living reminder that humanity is not trapped in the mud, that something inside of us is always trying to rise. And here's the part that most people miss, the part that changes absolutely everything. Quetzalcoatl was not a god who sat far away in the clouds. He wasn't distant. He wasn't untouchable. He was not an abstract. He was a God who descended, a God who took form, a God who walked among men. He breathed our air. He shared our pain. He shared our civilization. And he lived side by side with his people. Imagine how shocking this idea is for a moment. A perfect being chosen to become flesh. A divine presence chosen to swell in human imperfection. A heavenly power chosen to walk barefoot on the same earth as people he loves. It sounds familiar, right? But the story gets even more astonishing, because the people of Mesoamerica believed not metaphysically, not symbolically, not poetically, but literally, that Quetzalcoatl once took human form. They believe he lived as a wise king in the ancient city of Tulan. They believe he brought knowledge, morality, peace, architecture, astronomy as a gift that elevated humanity from savagery into civilization. They believe he suffered betrayal, endured temptation, fell, died, and promised to return at the end of an age. This wasn't just mythology, it was prophecy. A prophecy that lived in their calendars. A prophecy that shaped their wars, their politics, their rituals, their sense of cosmic destiny. And when you look at the story honestly, when you strip away the arrogance of our modern historians, you realize something staggering. They had already encountered a sacred Christ pattern long before the Spaniards had ever arrived. A God who bridged heaven and earth, a God who descended into human form, a God who teaches, sacrifices, and returns, a God whose life becomes the axis of time. A human heart recognizes this story, no matter the language, no matter the continent, no matter the tribe, because the story of Christ is not a European invention or a Middle Eastern invention. It is the fingerprint of divine written into the architect of the human soul. So when the people of Mesoamerica heard the story of Jesus for the first time, it did not feel like a foreign religion being forced upon them. It felt like the fulfillment of something they had already known in whispers, in symbols, in ritual, in prophecy. This is why Quetzalcoatl matters, because he proves something profound. Before Christ even crossed the oceans, before a cross was ever lifted in the New World, the people of the Americas have already been waiting for him. Every year, in the heart of the Aztec Empire, a moment occurred so strange, so stunning, so spiritually charged that the modern world can barely grasp it. It was the moment a man was chosen to become God, not symbolically, not metaphorically, but literally God. He was called the Izitla, the embodiment of the divine, a flawless young man selected with the precision of prophecy. His body had to be perfect, his face unmarred, his posture regal, his presence magnetic. He had to look like the world the gods intended, not the world men had broken. And when they found him, everything changed. For the moment he was chosen, he no longer walked as human. He walked as Tezcatlipoca on earth, the divine made flesh, destiny wearing a human heartbeat. He was dressed in jewelry that reflected the sun like living flames. He was taught the sacred songs, the priestly wisdom, the movement of kings. And everywhere he went, the people stopped. They bowed. They whispered a prayer. Mothers lifted their children so they could see him. The living reminder that perfection had not yet abandoned this world. For 1 full year, this man lived the dream every human secretly carries in their chest, to be recognized, to be adored, to be elevated beyond the smallness of ordinary life, to embody the divine spark that every soul dimly remembers but rarely touches. He was honored, he was loved, he was adored, he was celebrated. He became the mirror of what humanity could be if it remembered its origins. But then came the part, the story that makes the entire world stop breathing. Because the Aztecs knew a truth that we have forgotten. Anything sacred must be sacrificed so the world can be renewed. And so, as the final days approach, this God-man did not resist his fate. He didn't plead, he didn't run. He walked serenely, willingly, toward the altar in which he would offer his life. He played a flute as he walked, each note dissolving like a farewell to the world that had adored him. And as he reached the summit of the temple, he broke the flute, the symbol of his breath, and laid himself down. He gave his heart, his blood, his life, not in defeat, but in cosmic purpose. He died so the world would not. A God who became human, a God who dwelled among the people, a God who teaches through his life, a God who sacrificed himself to renew creation. I know this sounds familiar, right? Because the truth is this: the human soul has already known the pattern long before the name Jesus crossed the ocean. The story of Christ was already echoing in the hearts of the world. So, before you can understand Quetzalcoatl, you must understand the one who stands behind him, because Quetzalcoatl is not the beginning, he is the echo. The origin, the true source of all gods, was a power so vast, so mysterious, so primal that the Aztecs barely dared to name it. They called this being Emeteotl. And Emeteotl was unlike any god in the Western imagination. Emeteotl was not a warrior or a storm bringer or a sun deity locked in the sky. Emeteotl was existence himself, the pulse behind creation, the mind behind matter, the unity behind every duality that tears the world in two. Emeteotl was the father and mother, Alpha and Omega, light and shadow, order and chaos, becoming and being, fused in a single divine consciousness. This was the creator of creators, the source of all gods, the primordial fire from which every story, every myth, every sacred ritual emerged. And here is where the story takes a turn most people have not heard. Because in Mesoamerica cosmology, Imhotep did not remain silent, unreachable, abstract. Imhotep expressed the divine's essence into the world through one supreme emissary, one sacred sun. That sun was Quetzalcoatl. Long before the Spaniards arrived, long before a single cross was planted in Americas, the people of this land already carried a prophecy of a begotten son, not created but emanated, a divine offspring sent into the world to teach, to heal, to suffer, to give humanity back to the source. To them, Quetzalcoatl wasn't merely a feathered serpent god. He was the bridge between heaven and earth. He was the Word made flesh long before they had language to call it that. He was a divine intelligence taking human form because the world had fallen out of balance. And here is the part that would shock people. Quetzalcoatl wasn't worshipped because he was God. He was worshipped because he had suffered. He knew temptation. He knew exile. He knew what it meant to fall and rise again. He knew what it meant to walk as divine being in a broken world. And like Christ, he promised one thing, the single thread that ties every civilization together. I will return, not as myth, not as symbol, not as memory, but as a cosmic event that would align the world. This is the reason the story of Jesus made immediate, visceral sense to the people of Mesoamerica. They weren't hearing a foreign religion. They were hearing a prophecy they had carried in their blood for thousands of years. They recognized the sun returning in a new name because the divine spark is not limited to a culture or a language. A rose by any other name is still a rose, and Christ by any other name is still Christ. According to ancient calendars, the same calendar that would predict eclipses, harvest cycles, and the movement of Venus with terrifying accuracy, there was one prophecy that towered over the others. Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, the bringer of civilization, the God who descended into flesh, made a promise that echoed through every temple, every priesthood, every trembling king. In the year one reed, I will return. And the people believed him. They didn't believe the way we believe today, casually, politically, safely. No, they believed like their lives depended on it, because to them, everything was tied to cosmic law, to time, power, war, destiny. Their prophecy was not vague, it wasn't symbolic, it was exact, it was mathematical, it was written into the very architect of the universe as they understood it. One reed, a year encoded into the gear of their cosmic machine. A year when the door opened between heaven and earth, and it would open again. A year where the world could be remade. And the priest taught, he will come from the east. He will carry wisdom. He will initiate a new age, and we will end the cycle of suffering that demands blood. Imagine living in a world built around sacrifice, a world where the sun rises only because the hearts are offered, where the universe survives only through pain. And then hearing that one day a God will break this cycle, that one day sacrifice will end, that one day a new world will begin. This is not superstition. This was not wishful thinking. This was science to them, sacred mathematics, astronomical precision. Their entire civilization, their calendars, their coronations, their wars, their fears moved around this prophecy like planets around the sun. They waited for him for generations. They watched the eastern horizons. They counted the days, the moons, the revolutions of Venus, the turning of the cosmic wheel. And as the appointed years drew closer, anticipation turned into trembling. Because if the prophecy was true, that in the year one reed, the God King would return to reclaim his people. He would return to correct the world. He would return to bring the final revelation. They had no idea that the prophecy would fulfill itself in a way none of them could have imagined. because the universe always keeps its promise. And when one reed finally arrived, something came from the east, something that carried a cross. Then the impossible happened, the kind of event that feels like history and more like the universe revealing its hidden script. For centuries, the people of Mesoamerica had watched the stars, calculated the cycles, measured the divine rhythm of time itself. Their calendars weren't clocks, they were prophecies. And when these prophecies carved into the mathematics of heaven with a single promise, in the year one read, the God will return. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, but literally. And then, exactly on that year, at the precise hinge of their cosmic calendar, strangers appeared on the horizon. They came from the east, the direction of the dawn, of rebirth, of resurrection. Their ships rose over the ocean like shimmering temples. Their floating mountains of white cloth catch the breath of God. And these strangers carried crosses, the holiest symbol of sacrifice. They spoke of a God who became flesh, who lived among humanity, who allowed himself to be killed to save the world, and who rose again in glory. How could this not shake the soul of the people whose entire mythic history revolved around the gods who descended, who bled, who died, and who promised to return? To the people of Mesoamerica, this was not an invasion. This was not coincidence. This was not geography. This was destiny. This was prophecy manifesting in real time. And for them, this was Quetzalcoatl returning as promised, because here is the hook the world never tells. He did not return in the form they expected. He returned in the function they already understood. Quetzalcoatl was the bringer of knowledge. Christ is the Logos, the world made flesh. Quetzalcoatl was the God who walked among men. Christ walked, healed, taught, wept, bled, and he rose. Quetzalcoatl was the God who ended cycles through sacrifice. And Christ was the final sacrifice, the one who ended the altar forever. And suddenly the pieces clicked. The echoes aligned. The mystic puzzle completed itself. Because when the Spaniards arrived with the cross, they were carrying the very thing the Mesoamericans had been preparing for without even realizing it. The God who ended sacrifices. Not the God who demanded blood, but the God who gives his own. Not the God who asks for victims, but the God who becomes the victim. Not the God who resets the world through violence, but the God who transforms it through love. So, to the people watching the horizons that morning, trembling with recognition, their minds racing through every prophecy, every symbol, every ritual of their childhood, it was obvious. He had returned. He had come back in the year foretold. He came back from the east. He came back carrying the sign of liberation. He returned to end the cycle of blood. The prophecy was fulfilled, not in the way they expected, but in the way their souls had always been waiting for. You see, the Spaniards did not conquer an empire. They walked into a volcano that was already erupting within. This was the part of the story nobody tells. This is the part that changes everything. Because Hernan Cortés did not arrive with an army. He arrived with a whisper that the world was about to change. Yes, the Spanish were few, outnumbered. They were foreigners, strangers in a land of obsidian and fire. But the Aztec Empire was a colossus built on trembling legs, and every leg was a people they had broken, a people they had drained, a people they had devoured in the name of the sun. And when the Spanish arrived, they did not face one nation. They faced dozens of ancient people waiting for the moment when the cosmic wheel would finally turn. The Tlaxcalans, who had fought the Aztecs for generations, who said, "We would rather die free than live fattened for sacrifice." The Totonacs, whose children had been taken as tribute, not in gold, not in crops, but in blood. The Aztecs, beaten down until their gods had grown silent, their identity nearly stolen from them by an empire that demanded everything and gave nothing. These were not allies, these were not political partners. These were men awakening from centuries of oppression, suddenly hearing the story that felt like thunder rolling across mountains. They saw the Spaniards. They did not see invaders. They saw an opportunity written in their prophecies. They saw a chance to break cosmic equations that had devoured their sons. They saw the arrival of a cross as a rapture in fate, a crack in the system, a divine interruption in the endless cycle of sacrifice. To them, this was the moment the world had been waiting for, the moment the sun god would no longer demand hearts, the moment their children would no longer be taken, the moment when their empire that had lived by the knife would finally answer to something higher. These nations rose. They rose not because the Spanish were powerful, but because the Aztec Empire had sown its own destruction into the soil of every tribe it conquered. The Aztecs believed that they could rule through fear, but they forgot that fear accumulates interest, and when it comes due all at once. So that's why their empire fell, not because of guns, not because of steel, not because of horses, but because of the human spirit. When pushed to the edge of annihilation, will take the slightest glimmer of hope and turn it into revelation. And in the year one read, that hope arrived carrying a cross. Every civilization has felt the same truth in its bone, even if it spoke different language, carved different gods, or built different temples. Life requires sacrifice, not because the gods are cruel, but because existence itself is built on exchange. Something must die for something else to live. This is the architect of reality. And the ancients understood this viscerally. The Hebrews expressed it through offerings at the altar. The Mesoamericans expressed it through the cosmic drama of blood and sun and renewal. But here's the revelation. Both were reaching for the same truth. Both were shadows cast by the same eternal light. Both were echoes of a Savior they had not yet met. When the Hebrews brought their lambs, when the Mayans traced the cycle of Venus, when the Aztecs offered the heart of a perfect man at the height of a pyramid, they were all reenacting the same cosmic memory, a memory older than nations, older than language, older than pyramids and temples. That the world cannot be healed without sacrifice. But here's the twist, and this is where history becomes prophecy. Humanity was never meant to stay trapped in this cycle. The sacrifices were never the destination. They were the signposts pointing toward the one who would end them. Christ was not just the fulfillment of Hebrew scripture. He was the fulfillment of the entire human story. The end of the altar, the end of the knife, the end of blood debt between men and the divine. This is why his message detonated across continents. This is why cultures separated by oceans recognized him the moment he arrived. Because deep down, they had seen his story before. In every dying god, in every resurrected king, in every myth where a perfect man gives himself to renew the world, in every heart that has ever whispered, "Please, let this be enough." Christ had come to answer that whisper, and here's the part that gives historians chills, though few dare to say it out loud. He ended sacrifice in Jerusalem. He ended sacrifice in America. He ended it in both worlds. When the Spanish arrived carrying the cross, carrying the story of God, who became man and offered himself once for all, they unknowingly stepped into a prophecy thousands of years in the making. The Mesoamerican calendar had already prepared the people. Their myth had already foreshadowed him. Their ritual had already pointed towards him. They were waiting for a God who would return from the east, a God who would give his body for the world, a God whose sacrifice would make the end of all sacrifices. And Christ did return, not through thunder in the sky, but through the arrival of a message that shattered 1,000 years of human blood sacrifice. This is why the empire fell, not because of swords, but because of revelation. Christ ended human sacrifice in the old world, and then he crossed the ocean and ended it in the new. How is it possible that civilizations separated by oceans, by mountains, by desert, by centuries, civilizations that never traded, never exchanged scripture, never once heard of each other's language, somehow told the exact same story? How? Explain that. How did the Norsemen in the frozen north? How did the Mayans in the jungle? How did the Egyptians in the desert? How did the Aztecs at the heart of the Tenochtitlan all dream the same kind of God? A God who descended, a God who suffered, a God who died, a God who returned, and a God who restored the world. And here's the part that keeps your mind turning. They didn't just get similar themes. They didn't just get close enough. They got the sacred structure exactly right. The pattern is identical. The arc is identical. The spiritual math is identical. And you ask yourself why? Why does every myth point towards the same cosmic silhouette? Why does every culture intuitively know the shape of salvation long before they even heard the name Jesus? It's because the story of Christ is not regional. It's not tribal. It is not the property of one era, one people, one corner of history. The story of Christ is the architect of the human soul. It is the blueprint etched into our consciousness before we were ever born. It is the gravitational pull of the Spirit, drawing each culture toward the same divine shape. It is the echo of a memory humanity never consciously learned, yet somehow never forgot. Every myth is a fragment of that shattered mirror. Every legend is a whisper of a deeper truth. Every civilization, whether they know it or not, must reach for the same face behind the veil. When the Greeks dreamed of Dionysus torn apart and reborn, when the Egyptians worshipped Osiris, the god who died and came back to judge the dead, Norsemen foresaw Bard, the innocent son whose death broke the old world and ushered in the new. When the Maya told of the hero twins descending into the underworld, and when the Aztecs told of Quetzalcoatl, the god who lived among men, sacrificed himself, ascended to heaven, and promised to return. They were all circling the same center, the same form, the same divine principle. Christ is not a man. Christ is not just a Messiah. Christ is not just a historical moment. Christ is the primordial pattern, the archetype at the bottom of human consciousness, the axis around which every cultural spiritually imagination turns, the axis around which every culture's spiritual imagination turns. Every civilization was telling the same story because they were all wired to recognize the same truth. The sun descends, the sun suffers, the sun sacrifices, the sun rises, and the sun returns. This is why Christianity spreads across the world not like doctrine, but like recognition. It does not arrive as something foreign. It arrives as something familiar. The Viking heard the Gospels and said, "We know this story." The Maya heard it and said, "We have met him before." The Aztecs heard it and said, "He promised he would return." So Christ is not merely a chapter in human history. Christ is the united myth of mankind, the completion of every spiritual instinct humanity has ever had. And when you finally understand that, history stops looking like chaos, myth stops looking like fiction, and the world starts looking like what it truly is, a single unified story, with Christ standing at the center of it, foretold by every culture, anticipated by every myth, and recognized by every soul that still remembers the spark it came from. If the Aztecs carried the echo of Christ, how did they get the practice of the meaning so catastrophically wrong? How did a civilization that understood the pattern of God so clearly misread the practice and rituals? How did a people who knew the prophecy of the returning sun end up sacrificing their own sons at an altar of stone? How does a culture with such staggering spiritual intelligence, people who map the stars, calculated the cosmic cycles with supernatural precision, and recognized the divine pattern long before Europe ever whispered the name Jesus, fall into the darkness so deep that even they no longer see their own gods? What corrupted the story? What twisted the myth? What torn the divine pattern out of alignment? Because the truth is this: civilizations do not collapse because they lack belief. They collapse because they come to a destructive conclusion with absolute devotion. And Mesoamerica, this empire of astronomer priests and warrior kings, did not fall because they were primitive or ignorant or weak. They fell because their myth was hijacked. They fell because their spiritual mathematics, the very algorithm of their cosmos, were rerouted away from Divine Father and towards the shadow of the king who wants to dominate without mercy, the shadow of the warrior who does violence without virtue, the shadow of the magician who has knowledge without wisdom, and the shadow of the lover who desires without devotion, and the shattered reflection of the Holy Trinity, the divine unity that demanded human sacrifice. They fell because the story that began as revelation ended as distortion. And here's where it affects you, because the same thing is happening today. The same spiritual corruption, the same inversion of the sacred, the same smoke mirrors that deceived kings in Tenochtitlan is deceiving our shadow elites of our Christian nations right now. So in the next chapter, I will show you exactly how the Aztec world, this brilliant, disciplined, mythical, atoned civilization, was led step by step into the jaws of darkness, the same darkness we see today in our current global conflicts that demand human sacrifice. What forces seduced them, and what voice whispered to them?